Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. After leaving them, he went up on a mountainside to pray. Later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he was alone on land. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Shortly before dawn, he went out to them, walking on the lake. He was about to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. They cried out, because they all saw him and were terrified. Immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." Then he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely amazed. They had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened.
We often talk here about IKEA sermons, and today is going to be one of those. I'm going to give you the pieces, and then I want you to help me put it together. Because there are people in this room that are going through things I have never experienced. There are people with fears and challenges and opportunities that have never been mine. And when we put our experiences together, I think we have a much better idea as to how God would have us live through circumstances that perhaps we would never choose for ourselves. When I look around the room, I have a fairly good idea about what's happening in most of your lives. And I know that there's a lot going on. Both individually and collectively, we have a lot on our plates. So I don't know exactly where this is going, but I can tell you what this sermon is not going to be. It is not going to be a little trite Sunday school lesson which says, if you just have enough faith, if you just pray enough, if you just are enough, then all the storms in your life are going to disappear. Now, you may think that that's absurd, but I have to tell you that there are plenty of churches who will teach that. That if you just do enough, if you'll just be enough, if you just have enough faith, then everything's going to be okay. That's not what I read when I read this story. And I hope that when you get to the end of this, you will see that that is not the point at all. And so I don't want to seem critical here. I don't want to be harsh, but I think it's a bit rich when churches have that theological stance. And then when things don't work out, when the storms are still there despite everything that people do, then what do? Well, they turn around to those caught in the storms and they say, well, you must not have had enough faith. You must not have done this. You must not have done that. And so we heap upon the people that are already struggling all kinds of new challenge and hurt. Don't do that. Don't do that. We need to take a much more mature view of what's happening in the story. And I want to give you a little bit of background, and then I want you to help me unpack this. And what I really want to know from you is, how do you get through the storms of life? Because you're in it now, or you've been through it, or you're heading into it, as Susan said. How do you get through those storms? What has God taught you? What has she shown you? What has he done for you to help you with that? Because that's not something I can do for you. First of all, the background I was talking about. This is a situation where Jesus and the disciples are on the east shore of the Sea of Galilee. He sends them off to go to the west side in this boat, but he's going to stay behind. And I think one of the reasons for this is because his cousin, his friend, his spiritual colleague, John the Baptist, has just been killed by Herod. And we looked at that story a few weeks ago. Jesus is hurt. He's grieving because he is ultimately human. So he needs some time and some space for himself. And so he goes up into the hills to pray. And from there, he can see that the disciples are struggling. We're told in Mark's account that it's about 3:00 in the morning when the waves are beating on the boat. The winds are horrendous. These guys are struggling. And don't forget, some of these men are fishermen. They know a storm when they see one. And if they're scared, you know they have every right to be scared because they know what a storm can do. So here's Jesus, and you saw in the video, he's on the water. He's walking, and John says he was walking toward the boat. And they are just scared to death, all of them. And they cry out to him. And then things begin to change. But if we go over to the account that Matthew gives us, there's a little bit of an addition that you're not going to see in that video from Mark. Here's what he says. Immediately after this, Jesus insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and cross to the other side of the lake while he sent the people home. After sending them home, he went up into the hills by himself to pray, and night fell while he was there all by himself. Meantime, the disciples were in trouble, far away from land, for a strong wind had risen, and they were fighting heavy waves. Now look, this is included here because the writer wants to telegraph in a big way that this is not just a mild squall. This is a big storm. They're in the middle of the lake. Things are bad. So he's setting the stage here. And about 3 a.m, Jesus came toward them walking on the water. When the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified. In their fear, they cried out, "It's a ghost!" I mean, just imagine for a minute if you were to see something like this. How astonishing, how astounding that would be. They're not only scared, but now they're terrified because of this new experience. But Jesus spoke to them at once and he said, "Don't be afraid. Take courage. I'm here." Let me say that again. Take courage. Don't be afraid. I am here. Then Peter called to him, "Lord, if it's really you," where's he getting the doubt from? I'd really like to know. "Lord, if it's you, then tell me to come out of the boat." Wow. Jesus said, "Okay, yes, come." So Peter went over the side of the boat and walked on the water toward Jesus. But when he saw the strong wind and the waves, he was terrified and began to sink. "Save me, Lord," he shouted. And Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him. "You have so little faith," he says to Peter. "Why did you doubt me?" Okay, it's okay to doubt yourself, but why did you doubt me? That's what Jesus wants to know here. And when they climbed back into the boat, the wind stopped. Then the disciples worshiped him. "You really are the Son of God," they said. Wow, they're just now starting to catch on. After they had crossed the lake, and by the way, John's account says that as soon as the wind stopped, the boat went immediately to its destination, which was about 5 or 6 kilometers away, based on what we can judge. When the people recognized Jesus, the news of his arrival spread quickly throughout the whole area, and soon people were bringing all the sick to him. Okay, we can understand that, right? All right, so we have this side story about Peter getting out of the boat and being in the water. But that's not the first thing I want to deal with. I think what's really significant in Mark's account is a little notation here, and maybe you saw it and maybe you didn't. But I think in many ways, this is the most vital part of the story. And strangely, it's one that a lot of people don't deal with on a regular basis. But this is the part that really resonates with me. If you go back to the text, Jesus is walking on the water. They're terrified, but listen to this. Jesus saw that they were in serious trouble, rowing hard and struggling against the wind and the waves. And about 3 o'clock, Jesus came toward them walking on the water. He intended to go past them. When they saw him walking on the water, they cried out in terror, thinking he was a ghost. Okay, let me ask you this. Why on earth would Jesus be intending to go past them? And there are 2 main explanations for that, but I'm not going to tell you what they are until you tell me what you think. Why would Jesus go past them? They're struggling. They're clearly struggling. What's up with that? Let me give you the 2 scenarios, and maybe this will help a little bit. First of all, there are people who think that Jesus never intended to go by them. It just looked like that to the disciples. Although it does say here, and that's why I don't necessarily subscribe to this view, it says he intended to go past them. But that is a bit iffy in the translation. There are some different ways you could interpret that. But let's just assume that you're right, Tom, that there is this sense that he wants them to know who he is. What else does he want them to know while they're in this situation and he's right there on the water? What do they need to know? That they can call out to him. Yes. So Theory number one is that Jesus was going to handle this situation anyway, but he's waiting for them to ask. Now, if they had not asked, do you think that Jesus would have said, well, you missed your chance, I guess it's too bad for you, and just let them go? No, of course not. But I really do believe that a lot of what's happening in this story is the need for these men to recognize, first of all, that Jesus is God. And if he's God, then he has control not only over the elements, but anything else that comes into their lives. That is the same message that you and I need to take away from this story. Whatever your storm is, whatever it looks like, no matter the intensity, we need to use this to first of all recognize that Jesus is God poured into human flesh, that he not only loves us, but he knows what's best for us and will act on what's best for us. And then the second thing is, he wanted them to rely on him in the midst of the storm, and he wants you. He wants you to rely on him in the midst of your storm. And it would be good if you could ask him for that help. Generally speaking, I find we're pretty good about asking for God's help when we're really out of control, when we recognize there's nothing we can do in and of ourselves. But God's going to be there anyway. He's not going to make his love and his faithfulness conditional on your love or your faithfulness. But God wants us to reach out to him. God wants us to involve him in the process as a first response, not as a last resort. Yet so often, what do? Well, we face all of these health crises or financial uncertainty or relationship difficulties, and we think, okay, I'm going to do this by myself. And then what happens? Well, when everything falls apart, then we ask God to ride to the rescue and bless the mess. In life, the storm is the norm, not the lull. You will have some relief from time to time. But the storm is the norm. We're all going to have those storms. And we better get into the habit of inviting God into the situations, because we have no choice. You're going to go through what you're going to go through. Your only choice, as I say all the time, is whether you're going to allow God to work in that or whether you're going to do it by yourself. And if you are going to do it by yourself, what are you doing here? Really, you've got other things to do. We need to understand that God has the capacity, the power, and the love to give us what we need. And the way he convinces these men is very simple. He walks on the water as a demonstration that he's not bound by anything happening around them. You see, there are true realities in life. There's the one that's purely logical and intellectual, which says, all right, this is the way life works. We base that on our experience, and that's all there is. That's the one view. The alternative view is there is a spiritual dimension. God is at work in powerful, meaningful ways, and we can access that power if we're willing, and if that's what we want. That's part and parcel of what these men are learning here. But Jesus wants them to know that he is the Son of God. And it goes back to that passage that Don read for us. There's an echo of Job 9 here, because if you remember that passage, it says that even if God passed by Job, his splendor and his majesty and his might would be so overwhelming that Job wouldn't be able to comprehend it. I think that's what Jesus is trying to get these men to see, that God has this wonderful ability to bless them and to empower them when they cannot do that themselves. And they're going to need that in the days ahead. By the way, you might not realize this, but in the ancient world, it was often said that kings could walk on water. We know that the great Persian king Xerxes was said to be able to walk on water. Alexander the Great, he could walk on water too. That's what the mythology said. Job says no king can walk on the water except God. And Jesus does. So the text is making the link here between the sovereignty and the power of God and Jesus, who is God in their midst, who is God in our midst. We need to recognize that. Do you remember that story from Exodus 33 where Moses is in the wilderness and he's worried because they have battles to fight? Moses says, God, if you're not going to go with us, don't take us there. Don't let me go there. Unless you're coming with me, I don't want to go. The people don't want to go. So God stages a little bit of a demonstration, an object lesson. He takes Moses, he puts him in a cleft of a rock, and then there's an earthquake, and there's a big storm, and there's all this dramatic stuff that happens. But we're told that God isn't in that. And then there's this still small whisper where God makes himself known to Moses, not in the bold and the big and the dramatic, but in that quiet, powerful presence. Maybe God will give you something incredibly dramatic to show you his presence. Maybe he will reveal himself in the much smaller detail of your situation, but reveal himself nonetheless. Keep your eyes and your heart open for that. You really need to keep your eyes and heart open for that. So if the point is, A, Jesus wants these people and us to recognize that he is God Almighty, that he has the power to intervene and make a difference, then the second point is he wants us to rely on that, to invite that into our lives so that we can be living, moving, breathing testimonies to the goodness of God. That's our role, our responsibility. I think what's happening is Jesus did mean to intervene, regardless. But there are other people who think that Jesus was diverted in this story, that he was going to walk right by, that he fully intended to walk by. Because, as I said, the people in the boat would still see that he was there. He didn't really feel the need to be in the boat because they should know that whether he's with them physically or whether he's outside the boat, he's still there, still in control. So it's quite possible that he just didn't mean to get into the boat because he didn't think that he'd have to. But when he saw the distress of the men thrashing against those waves, he had compassion on them and decided that, yes, he would go into the boat because they needed his presence. That's the version I'm going with. That says more about Jesus, I think, than, well, I'm just waiting for you to tell me that you need help. And I think we have to take a lesson from that. It's really important for us to see that when he sees us struggling, when he knows we're hurting, he's not going to be oblivious to that. He's going to act on that, whether you invite him into the boat or not. But please, one thing before I go to you, the story does not communicate that just because you have the faith, everything's going to be okay. Jesus calms the storm, but that is not a guarantee that he's going to calm the storm, at least in terms of circumstances in your life. This is not a template for every situation. And if you've had, say, 2 hours of living in the real world, you know that that's the truth. The bad stuff doesn't go away just because we're being faithful. But God never, ever deserts us. He will calm us if he doesn't calm the storm. He will give us the capacity to get through. And so I'm asking you again, how do we do this? How do we make that part of our experience in a meaningful way instead of taking that simplistic view that, okay, God's going to just make everything fine as long as I shut my eyes and hope real hard. How do we? And we have a great example also in the Matthew account. Remember what he said? Take courage. Why? Why? Because I am here. Now, there is a difference in your circumstances and mine between God being involved and active in your circumstances and God being absent in your circumstances. He's promised not to do that. He will not forsake us. He will not desert us. He will not ignore us. And that's where faithfulness begins. It is so important for us to cultivate the presence of God, because if you wait for the storms and you have absolutely no way of knowing God, because you don't have a relationship with him, he's not going to make a difference in the storm. So know the promises of God. Rely on the promises of God. That is very good advice. And of course, it goes back to what I was saying earlier. You can't treat God like the spare tire or the emergency kit where you only pull him out when you need him, because you're not going to have any relationship with him. You won't have any trust in him. We have to cultivate an awareness of his presence in the big and in the small, in the good and in the bad. And then when the crises do hit, we'll know him enough to recognize what he's doing, and we'll have the confidence to place ourselves in his hands. These men have developed spiritual amnesia. The feeding of the 5,000 doesn't seem to have sunk in. Well, the writer even says they didn't get it. So God, with his infinite sense of humor, says, watch this. And then when they're on the water, he arrives again. He acts in this incredible way. And I'd like to tell you that that's where it really starts to happen for these guys. But even at the end of the life of Jesus, they're still having doubts. They're still having qualms. They're still having all kinds of fears. So it's like this growth process really is a lifelong one. So ease up on yourself. If you're feeling like you should have more faith than you do right now, cut yourself some slack, because even the people that spent all these years with Jesus struggled with this. What else can we do? We need to pray, rely on the promises of God. We need to cultivate a personal, consistent relationship with him. But our obedience and submission to God cannot be conditional on whether he gives us the miraculous ending we want. Remember your past. Remember the past of the people of God. Understand that he has this history of acting and moving and working in ways that are surprising and miraculous and unexpected. We do have a God of surprises and miracles. Let's not lose sight of that. But don't say, unless I get that, then I just can't believe this stuff. God will give you deliverance from whatever you're going through, just as he always has. But you need to remember your story. And I think that's what you're saying. That's a vital, vital part of this whole equation. He will give you strength, courage, clarity, wisdom. He will give you the support of brothers and sisters and people you love. He will give you what you need to get through if you are open to receiving those things from him. So whether he spares you from the storm or whether he gets you through the storm, God is faithful. Okay, I think that raises a very important point. Some of you may be ticked at me for saying this, but here goes anyway. This is not an organization. This is not an institution. This is a family. What do families do when there's a crisis? They come together. They love and support and help each other in every way possible. Do not take the view that says, I'm just going to hold this to myself. I'm not telling anybody. Because number one, that shows a fundamental lack of trust in us. And it deprives you of any way to receive the love and the support and the help and even the prayers of people who love you. So be upfront, be transparent, because you know what? It might be your turn now, but it will be my turn eventually. And we need to build relationships of trust that allow us to be candid and to know that we will be accepted no matter where we are in our thinking, and we will be supported because that's just who we are. So we have to have that relationship, not just with God, but with one another too. And we have to treat it like it's real. Otherwise, you may as well be in a church with 3,000 people in the pews, because that's about how much support you're going to get if you just keep it all inside. Let's recognize we have a part to play. God wants us to do whatever we can when we're in the fire, when we're in the storm. But ultimately, we have to know and we have to acknowledge that he is the one who will make things happen. We need to play our part, but it's a small part in comparison. That's a very important lesson. So thank you for that. At the risk of repeating myself, my last point is a simple but powerful one. Sometimes you will have an end to the storm, and things will work out in ways that you never could have expected, ways that make you glad and joyous, make you so incredibly buoyant. And sometimes that's not going to happen, and you're just going to have to endure the storm. And you might be tempted to say, well, if that's the case, then what's the point of having faith? And I guess my answer to that is, I didn't say that you wouldn't have resources. I just said you wouldn't necessarily have the happy ending you want. God will give you what you need. That needs to be enough. The rest is gravy. As we say here often, sometimes God calms the storm. Sometimes God calms the sailor.
Amen.